Hello, and welcome to Why the Book Wins, a podcast where I compare books with their movie adaptations, and through these discussions, you will learn why 9 times out of 10, the book wins. This probably goes without saying, but there will be spoilers for both the book and the movie in this episode, so if you plan on reading this book or watching the movie, go do that first, and then come back and listen to this. Unless, of course, you are just wanting to know what you're getting into before reading the book or seeing the movie, and you don't mind the plot being spoiled, in which case, go ahead and listen. But without further ado, let's get right to it. Hi, thanks for tuning in to today's very special episode where I am celebrating my 1-year mark in podcasting. So August 12th, 2020 is when I posted my first blog/podcast for Why the Book Wins. Writing a blog where I compare books and movies is something that I had thought about doing for a few years now, actually. And unsurprisingly, COVID-19 just seemed like the perfect time to put that into action. Now that I've been doing this for 1 year, I thought I would share a little bit about me and why I started this podcast and blog, and what some of my favorite books and movies have been from the past year, as well as choosing a least favorite. So I thought I would share a little background on why I started this blog and what gave me the idea. So when I was a kid, we would often do like the summer library reading programs that they would have. And 1 year, it was the summer after 4th grade, going into 5th grade. For this library thing we were doing, they had us write a paragraph comparing a book with the movie version. And I wrote mine about Where the Red Fern Grows, which I had loved. And I remember when I wrote this paper, I just remember just tearing into that movie and talking about how terrible it was and it did not measure up to the book at all and explaining why. And even though this was just like a fun summer thing, and it wasn't for a grade, obviously, I just remember getting really into it and I just loved writing this. And I'm pretty sure I wrote more than what was expected. And then fast forward to 2015, I was reading The Picture of Dorian Gray and I remember thinking how cool it would be to start a podcast. At the time I was thinking of doing it as a blog. So starting a blog where I compare books and movies. I didn't go through with it at the time though, mainly just because I was lazy, I guess. I also didn't know how to start a blog, and I could have Googled it, but yeah, ultimately I just wasn't motivated enough to actually follow through with it. Fast forward to 2020, and with the extra time amidst COVID, I decided to finally do it. I had also started a running blog a few years prior, so I now knew how to create a blog and get visitors to it. And my blog, by the way, is 262.run, which I still have. I'm not quite as active on there as I used to be, but I got into running marathons a few years back, and so I became obsessed with running and marathons and run gear, and so I started a blog. So that was really fun, and I still do work on it, and I still run marathons. But anyway, so I decided to go ahead and start a blog for books and movies, and then we happened to have like a recording mic that wasn't being used. And I remember seeing it and I was like, oh, I could do this as a podcast. That would be so different and fun. I still stuck with the blog format as well, though, mainly because I didn't know the first thing about promoting a podcast, but I did know how to promote a website. And so even though my main goal is to have people listen to the podcast, I have the blog as a way to bring them to it, like through promoting my website. And then hopefully they would click on the blog from there. But of course, people who come across my website and just read the blog is also appreciated, especially if they leave a comment afterwards. And then with the progress I've made on this blog, so just a few weeks ago, I had my first guest on the podcast, and then last week I had my second guest. So mine is the only review podcast I can think of where it's just one host. Like most people that are reviewing books or movies or comparing books and movies, there's usually 2 or more of them. And recording with someone else definitely felt weird because I'm not used to it, obviously, and it was also just a different format too than I usually have it all outlined as you know, how it's going to go. So having a guest kind of changes that. I get why people do have a co-host though, because I think it helps there to be a more interesting conversation about the book and movie when there are different opinions. Having said that, even though I will have guests in the future again, I don't see ever having a permanent co-host. I like having 100% control over the podcast and what books and movies I choose, and so it's probably always just going to be me, but with a guest here and there. It was really fun having someone else on, though, and I have a few more guests penciled in for the next few months. And because I am just so cool and so hip, my last 2 guests, as well as my upcoming guests, are all members of my family. At some point, it would be cool to have someone who is like in the industry in some way on and get more insight into that. For now, though, I love having family as my guests. Growing up, we were all really into movies and into reading, and so it was a big part of our childhood. And we're all still into movies, and most of us still like reading, some more than others. But so it's really cool just having them on and talking about books and movies. So for the last year, I have posted reviews of 30 different books, so books/movies. And there are 52 weeks in a year. And though I had intended on taking some time off here and there, I ended up taking way more off than I thought I would. So I missed 22 weeks. Having said that, 30 episodes still isn't bad. And my year mark is August 12th. And so Lion makes it 31 posts that I've had, but technically that was posted after the year mark, but I'm including it in this podcast anyway. So of the 30 books I have read, some of my favorites would be If Beale Street Could Talk, Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, The Picture of Dorian Gray, 12 Years a Slave, and Annihilation. So Beale Street is such a beautifully written book, and it deals with the injustices Black Americans face while also being a romance. It is a book that has really stuck with me, and I highly recommend it. The movie is also amazing, but I'll actually be talking about that a little later in this episode. Suck City is about struggling with relationships, finding who you are, and dealing with addiction. This book is a memoir, and it's also beautifully written, and it's just so captivating. Once again, the movie adaptation is also really good, and I recommend that as well. It's called Being Flynn. I do prefer the book, ultimately, though, but the movie is still good. And I think my podcast for that one was pretty good, too. So if you want to give that a listen, I recommend it. The Picture of Dorian Gray I love because, once again, it's just beautifully written. And it's also just such a classic story that has been retold over and over again. It's a book that I think will just stick with you and make you reflect. And by the way, those first 3 books that I just mentioned, they're all written by poets, which explains why they're just also beautiful. Even when talking about difficult and ugly things such as racism, addiction, selfishness, vanity. So covering these ugly topics, but written in just such a beautiful, captivating way. And then 12 Years a Slave is an important book because there are incredibly few books written by someone who was actually a slave and describing what it was like. Solomon Northrop's story is a tragic one, yet also amazing because he was able to make it back home in the end. Though as I talk about in my podcast for that one, shortly after his return, he mysteriously disappeared again and nobody knows what happens to him. Then we have Annihilation, which is a sci-fi book so unlike any sci-fi I have ever read. And I was so intrigued by the weirdness, but also by the biologist herself and her story. The movie is also amazing, and I highly recommend it. And that's another one where I think my coverage about it is worth listening to. So if you want to check that one out. And then I have a couple honorable mentions, and that is Jurassic Park and A Scanner Darkly. Jurassic Park I wanted to mention just because it took me by surprise. Like, I hadn't expected it to be as good as it was. It's just such a fun, fascinating, and sometimes scary, eerie. But yeah, so that was really a really good book. And then A Scanner Darkly I enjoyed because it's just such a trippy book and so well written. And after reading this, it's about someone who's losing his mind. Basically, he's going crazy because of these drugs he's on. And when you're reading it, I felt like I was going crazy when I read it because he just does such a good job at putting you in his shoes. So that was a good one. It's also written as a warning to others because Philip K. Dick based the story loosely on his own experience. And at the end, he shares a list of names of people he was friends with and the effects drugs have had on their lives. So my favorite movie adaptation of the 30 I have covered, I think my favorite movie from the bunch would be There Will Be Blood, based on the book Oil. However, I would not say that this is my favorite adaptation because it is so different from the book. Not only are there changes just to the story, but it also just doesn't even stay true to the overall theme and feel of the book. I don't mind this because I like the movie better. So Paul Thomas Anderson just kind of took the idea of an oil man, his son, and a local prophet, so to speak, and he just kind of ran with it from there and left out everything else, all the other major details. And if you want to know more about all the changes that are made from book to movie, you can check out that episode. And so even though I would say that was my favorite movie I covered, as far as my favorite adaptation, I would have to say some favorites are Catch Me If You Can, Shutter Island, Lion, I'm Thinking of Ending Things, and 12 Years a Slave. And I feel like I should toss Cool Hand Luke in there too, because that movie is just such a classic and is worth watching. Catch Me If You Can was a great adaptation because although they veer from what really happened in not a lot of ways, but they definitely veer from the truth. However, I think the changes they made created a more compelling and touching story. Then we have Shutter Island, which is another DiCaprio movie, and this adaptation follows the book really closely, and it's probably one of the more faithful adaptations I've watched. The novel was fantastic, but I chose to mention the movie instead because the visuals are just so incredible, and then the acting, of course, is amazing. The book does give you more background with Teddy and his wife and stuff, and so I still would recommend the book because I really did like it. Or, I mean, if you don't want to read the book, you can just listen to my episode on that one and find out what the changes were, or like what the background info we missed out on in the movie was. And that one is also directed by Martin Scorsese, which I think a lot of people forget about. So yeah, great movie. And then Charlie Kaufman did an amazing job with I'm Thinking of Ending Things by taking the book and its themes and putting his own spin on it while still sticking to like the vibe of the book. And I love adaptations like this because it isn't just the director / scriptwriter taking the book and making a movie replica. Instead, they put their own take on it and really make it their own. Not that I have a problem with movies that follow the book extremely close, though, because, I mean, I just listed Shutter Island as one of my favorites, and that one is very close to the book. But I appreciate both kinds of adaptations. And, by the way, I'm Thinking of Ending Things was by far the most played episode of the past year. I released it soon after the movie came out, so that helped. It was also a movie that was hard to understand, so I think a lot of people were Googling it, and so that helped. The second most was Jurassic Park, but Ending Things had over double the amount of plays as Jurassic Park had. And Crazy Rich Asians, by the way, was a close third. Anyway, back to my favorite adaptations. Lion is another one I'm mentioning. That was a great one, and I loved how emotional it was. It took an incredible true story and included the emotion that was sometimes missing from the book, I thought. And so they just really brought that story to life in a really vivid way that the book kind of was lacking in some ways. And that episode is one I did with my sister, and I highly recommend listening to us discuss it. It also, I mean, I don't know if I'm biased listing it here because it is just so fresh in my mind. Like, if I was making this favorite list 6 months from now, I don't know. I think Lion would still be on there because it was a really good adaptation and it is a really powerful story, and the movie is just really beautifully done. So highly recommend. Then 12 Years a Slave is also a very faithful adaptation, and it just brings Solomon Northrup's story to life. It's sometimes painful to watch, but Steve McQueen just does an amazing job, and the acting is so powerful and real. So I highly recommend both the book and the movie with that one. So my least favorite book, I think I would have to say We Were Soldiers. Sorry, Joe. It's not that it's poorly written. I think it just isn't a topic that I'm drawn to. I am glad to have read it and watched the movie, though, because I did learn things. Because it's based on a true story about a battle during the Vietnam War. And I also really enjoyed doing the podcast, too, because it was with my brother, and he's very knowledgeable with military stuff because he's an officer in the Army. So even though that book may not have been a favorite, I still really loved doing that episode, and I would recommend checking it out. And yeah, just because I didn't like the book doesn't mean others wouldn't. Like my brother Joe likes it because military talk like that is just second nature to him because he's in the military. Whereas someone like me, it was just a bit too dense at times. And then another one I thought I would mention is The Drop. That book was written to be released in conjunction with the movie, and it just didn't seem necessary. Yes, we learned a bit more background on the characters. However, it just wasn't background info that was pertinent. Like, it was extra information we didn't even need, and I don't know, it didn't add much to the story, really. So I would definitely say to just stick with the movie when it comes to that one. Then my least favorite movie adaptation, I think I would say The Woman in the Window. The source novel wasn't the best out there, but then the movie took some liberties that just ruined it for me. Like that ending, ugh. Amy Adams is in the lead role and she gives a solid performance. But then they have Jennifer Jason Leigh, who is an incredible actress. And yet here, like, I don't think she even had any lines. Like, maybe she said one thing in the whole movie. Like, what's even the point? Julianne Moore, Gary Oldman, and Anthony Mackie are also supporting roles. But once again, the roles are so brief that they just weren't utilized as much as they should have been. You should check out my episode for that one, though, to learn the bizarre story surrounding the author of that book. So that was interesting to read about. And then another one I thought I would mention is the John Wayne version of True Grit. It was just a really forgettable movie. Like, they stuck close enough to the story, but yeah, it was just pretty forgettable. But again, I might be biased because in general, I just don't love Westerns anyway, so that could also be why. And I also, in particular, do not like John Wayne. He's just so overrated, and I don't find him very talented. So, yeah. And then in this episode, I also wanted to take the opportunity to mention some things I wish I could add or change to former episodes. For starters, in my episode for If Beale Street Could Talk, I am far too harsh on the movie. I had read the book twice in a short period of time, and I just loved it so much, and I just went into that movie being overly critical. Looking back, like, it was an incredible film, and it's so beautiful, and Barry Jenkins is so amazing and talented, and he did a fantastic job bringing Beale Street to life. So, sorry I was so harsh with that earlier. I also did a podcast for Girl Interrupted, which is about being in a mental institution, and it talks about various personality disorders. And I did do research before doing that episode on just these different disorders and things, but I have since learned more, and I wish I would have done a better, more thorough and informative podcast on that subject. I think it could have been really interesting. I will be covering a book in October that kind of deals with personality disorders, so maybe I'll get into it then. And then in my episode on Limitless, I say that there was no alternate ending, even though it seems like there would have been. Literally, like a week after I posted that episode, I found out that there was an alternate ending. So, spoilers ahead for the movie Limitless. I mean, it came out like 10 years ago, but if you haven't seen it and you don't want the ending ruined, then you can skip ahead 30 seconds. But in this alternate ending, Van Loon approaches Eddie like we see, and he tells him that he's going to shut down Eddie's lab, and that Eddie is basically in the palm of his hand and has to do what he says if he wants to keep on getting NZT. And then after this, Eddie tells Van Loon off, though in a different way than the ending the movie has. He tells him that he doesn't need Van Loon and he doesn't need NZT and he can figure out a way off of it. And so then Van Loon leaves, and in a voiceover he talks about how, that's the point of NZT, is figuring things out, and he's going to find a way to get off it and to not die. And then it kind of ends. And so even though it is more ambiguous than the original ending, it's not ambiguous like in a dark way, the way the book was. Like this one, it makes it seem like it's going to be fine and he's going to figure a way out, because that's what NCT does. And yeah, so although this one doesn't show him meeting up with his girlfriend at the end, so that's another bigger change. And then when I covered Slumdog Millionaire and the book it was based on, Q&A, I forgot to mention a huge reason why I liked the book better. So in the book and movie, he's not getting on the show to win money. Has alternative motives for the show in both cases, but in the book, he's on the show for a different reason than he is in the movie. And in the book, it was just this huge twist ending that I had not been expecting. Like, I talk about it in that podcast, but I don't want to have a spoiler, so if you want to hear what that twist was, you can listen to the episode. But so I mentioned that that's a change, but I didn't mention how much I liked it. So that was one big reason why I liked the book better than the movie. And then this is a more minor thing, but the book Annihilation was written by Jeff Vandermeer. But for some reason in that episode, I keep calling him James Vandermeer. Like, I didn't notice it when I was filming, and I didn't notice it when I was editing the podcast. But when I listened to it once it was airing, I noticed I kept calling him James. So I don't know why I was doing that, but his name is Jeff Vandermeer. And this is also kind of a minor one, but in the episode for Suck City and Being Flynn, I said that the director Paul Weitz did the American Pie movies. And this is slightly inaccurate because he actually only directed the first one. He didn't do all of them. So I kind of make it seem like he was part of that whole franchise, but he wasn't. And then I thought I would also share some books and movies I plan on covering in year 2 of this podcast. So for starters, in like 3 weeks, I'll be posting a podcast on the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, and I will have a guest on that episode. And this is just such an amazing and important book. And if it counted towards year 1, I definitely would have claimed it as one of my favorites. And I'm really excited for you guys to hear Henrietta Lacks' story if you haven't heard about it already. If you haven't heard of her or the book or the movie and you don't know what HeLa cells are, you should still listen to the episode because I think it'll be really informative and it's something that we have all benefited from, even if you don't realize it. So definitely tune into that one. I am also looking forward to my October reads, which will include Interview with the Vampire and a gothic novel by Charlotte Bronte. I might be getting their names confused, but that one maybe, it's not totally Halloween-esque, but I mean, it's a gothic novel, so I figure it counts anyway. And then as well as a book by Lois Duncan, which I loved her books when I was in high school, like junior high school. So it'll be interesting to come back and read them like 15 years later. So we'll see what I think about it. There's also a Stephen King book I'm going to be covering, but it won't be in October because I decided to make October dedicated to all female authors. So Stephen King will probably be the first week in November when I post that one. And then I will also be covering Little Woman. We'll be specifically covering the latest version of the movie, the one that came out in 2019. And I haven't seen it yet, and I haven't read Little Woman in ages, so that'll be a good one. And I will have a guest as well. And fun fact, the guest, who is my sister, we are both related to Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Woman. So that's cool. And then I'll also be covering some new releases, which I'm very excited about, such as House of Gucci, Nightmare Alley, and Flag Day, which Flag Day is next week's podcast. I have also anxiously been awaiting the movie Death on the Nile, but it keeps getting pushed back. It's now supposed to be released in February of 2022, so here's hoping they stick to that. Death on the Nile was one of my favorite Agatha Christie books, so I've really been looking forward to this adaptation. And as I said, this year I did 30 episodes, so 30 book and movies. Actually, it was more than that, because for some episodes I did 2 books or 2 movies if there are multiple versions. But anyway, going into year 2, I want to be more consistent. I plan on releasing a podcast like for 12 weeks straight, and then taking a week or 2 off, and then doing another 12 weeks. So something like that, because I want to give myself breaks because I don't want to get burnt out, but I also want to make sure I'm more consistent. I also might do like separate podcasts out if I'm covering a book that has 2 adaptations, I might do it in 2 episodes rather than talking about both adaptations in 1 episode, but we'll see. Oh, and I also am planning on doing The Count of Monte Cristo. I don't know when that will be, because it's an incredible book, but it's just such an undertaking because it's so long, and that's one that I would definitely separate out into 2. I don't know if it'll be earlier on, like beginning of 2022 or, yeah, anyway, sometime in the next year. But I guess that wraps it up for today's 1-year celebration. If you enjoy my podcast, I would love it if you shared it with others. It would also mean a lot to me if you left me a review, specifically on Apple Podcasts. You can also follow me on Instagram at Why the Book Wins. And I recently made a Facebook page, so you can like my Facebook page, facebook.com/whythebookwins. And I also have links to all this on my blog, whythebookwins.com. But on social media, I post different polls on there, and so it gives you a chance to participate by helping me choose what books to cover and to feel part of the podcast. And then I also made a Buy Me a Coffee account where you can donate a couple bucks to support the podcast. But more than anything, I just appreciate that you are listening to this podcast, and I am glad you're enjoying it, or at least I hope you're enjoying it. Yeah, here is to year 2 of Why the Book Wins. Thanks for listening. Thanks again for listening. If you want to find me on other platforms, you can check out my Facebook, so facebook.com/whythebookwins, or my Instagram, which is all one word, whythebookwins, or you can go to my website, whythebookwins.com. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can reach out to me on any of those. I also have a Buy Me a Coffee account where you can show your support by donating a couple bucks to the podcast. So that's buymeacoffee.com/whythebookwins. But the fact that you are simply listening to the podcast means a lot to me, and I really appreciate it. And don't forget to subscribe and follow and tune in next Wednesday for the latest episode of Why the Book Wins.